At Thanksgiving, my stepmom announced, "I've decided to give your room to your stepsister," and kicked me out. My dad was silent, and my sis was laughing at me, so I left. But 5 days later, when Dad called, everything changed. Thanksgiving was supposed to be about family. But in our house, it was just another chance for my stepmother, Marissa, to remind everyone who was in charge. She had been running the show since the day she married my father. He was successful, owned his own business, but when it came to Marissa, he was completely spineless. She used to be a model, and even though she was pushing 40, she still carried herself like she was the most important person in any room. She had this way of getting what she wanted. If my dad ever pushed back, she would just threaten to leave, and that was enough to shut him up. Marissa and her daughter, Lydia, had moved in with us 2 years earlier. Lydia was 17, spoiled, and treated like royalty by her mother. She barely did anything for herself, and Marissa made sure she never had to. If something wasn't handed to her on a silver platter, she would whine until she got it. That Thanksgiving, the house was filled with Marissa's side of the family. My dad's house, our house, had basically become her family gathering place. I was used to being the outsider at these things. They never really treated me like family. But this time was different. In the middle of dinner, while everyone was laughing and drinking, Marissa tapped her wine glass to get everyone's attention. Then, with a beaming smile, she said something that made my stomach drop. "I've decided to give your room to Lydia." At first, I thought I had misheard her. I looked at my dad, waiting for him to say something, but he just stared at his plate. Marissa kept talking, acting like this was a perfectly normal thing to do. "Lydia needs more space. Her room is too small, and she needs to focus on her fitness. I put a treadmill in there, but there's no room for it, so I thought, why not give her Ethan's room? It's bigger, and honestly, he doesn't need it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I looked at Lydia, who was grinning like she had just won the lottery. She looked at me and laughed. "Yeah, Ethan, you don't mind, do you?" I was too stunned to say anything. The worst part was that her relatives immediately jumped in, making jokes about how it was a good idea, how Lydia deserved it, how I was old enough to handle it. Then Marissa looked right at me. "I want this Thanksgiving to be better, and I think it would be better if you weren't here." Just like that, she didn't even try to hide what she was doing. She turned to my dad and said, "Give him some money for a trip or something. He can stay somewhere else for a while." My dad hesitated for a second, but he pulled out his wallet anyway. He gave me $500 without looking at me, and that was it, my own father paying me to leave. I had no choice but to pack. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just left. The next morning, I went to my friend's house. Luckily, I was already making my own money, about $1,500 a month, as a bike messenger, so I wasn't completely screwed. I figured I'd find a way to make it work, but I didn't have to wait long. 5 days later, everything changed. My dad called me and said, "Come home." When I did, Marissa and Lydia were gone. I didn't know what to expect when I got back. My dad hadn't said much on the phone, just told me to come home. His voice sounded different, but I couldn't tell if it was regret, exhaustion, or something else. When I walked through the front door, the house was eerily quiet, no Marissa barking orders, no Lydia whining about something stupid, just silence. I dropped my bag by the door and looked around. The dining room table still had decorations from Thanksgiving, but there were no dirty dishes, no signs that anyone had lived there in the last few days. It was as if they had vanished. My dad was sitting in the living room with a drink in his hand. He looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw something almost like guilt on his face. "They're gone," he said. I waited for him to say more, but he just took a sip of his drink and stared at the floor. "What do you mean gone?" I finally asked. He let out a breath as if he had been holding it in for years. "I kicked her out." I almost laughed. "You? You kicked her out?" He nodded. "Yeah, I couldn't believe it." This was a guy who had let Marissa walk all over him for years, who had sat silently while she kicked me out like I was nothing. and now he was suddenly growing a backbone. Why? I asked, still skeptical. He rubbed his face. Because I finally saw her for what she was. That didn't make sense. He had been blind to them for years. What had changed? Then he motioned for me to follow. I did, and when we got to Lydia's old room, my old room now, I guess he pushed the door open, and I saw what was really happening. The room was a disaster. Clothes were thrown everywhere. Drawers were emptied. Posters were ripped off the walls. But what caught my attention was the treadmill. It wasn't just in the room, it was smashed. The screen was cracked, the frame bent, as if someone had taken a baseball bat to it. "What's going on?" I muttered. Dad sighed. "The night you left, Lydia had a temper tantrum. She didn't want the treadmill in her room anymore. She said it took up too much space. Marissa got mad at me for even suggesting she use it. They fought about it for hours. I raised an eyebrow. Over a treadmill? Over everything, he corrected. Marissa started complaining about how she deserved better, how she didn't want to live in a house where she had to fight about stupid things. She started threatening to leave again, and for the first time, I realized I didn't care anymore. I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was kidding me. This guy had put up with Marissa's crap for years, let her turn him into a doormat, and now, just like that, he was done. But then he said something that made my jaw drop. I told her to get out, and I meant it. I blinked. "And she just left?" He laughed, but it was bitter. "Not right away. She screamed. She threw things. She said I'd regret it. But when I didn't back down, she packed her things, grabbed Lydia, and left. I didn't know what to say. I should have been happy. That was what I wanted, right? Marissa and Lydia gone, and my dad finally seeing her for who she was. But instead, I felt this strange, uncomfortable feeling in my stomach. "Where did they go?" I asked. "I have no idea," he admitted. "But I have a feeling they're not finished with us." I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but I would soon. Because Marissa and Lydia weren't going to disappear quietly. They were going to make our lives a living hell. For a few days, it felt like things were finally back to normal. No Marissa parading around like a queen. No Lydia treating me like garbage. The house was as quiet as it had been in years. My dad was even talking to me more, asking about my job, even making dinner. It was strange, but I didn't hate it. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't last. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a big envelope in the mail. My father opened it at the kitchen table while I was eating breakfast. I watched his face turn pale. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He just kept flipping through the papers, his jaw clenching. Then he threw them on the table. "She's suing me." I picked up the papers and flipped through them. Divorce papers. Marissa was asking for half of everything. His business, the house, even spousal support. She claimed she had sacrificed her career to be with my dad and was entitled to financial compensation for the life she had given up. I laughed. She was a model for what? 5 years? That was decades ago. What life did she give up? My father didn't laugh. "Doesn't matter. Her lawyer is good. If she wins, I could lose everything." I could see the panic in his eyes. Marissa had drained him emotionally for years, but now she was coming for him financially. And the worst part? She might actually win. Things got worse that afternoon. I had just finished a shift as a bike messenger when I received a text message from an unknown number. "Better start packing. This house won't be yours for long." I stared at the message. Then another came. "Enjoy your last days playing house with Daddy. The Queen is coming back." I didn't have to ask who it was. I knew Lydia. I ignored her. I wasn't going to let her get in my head. But when I got home, I realized they weren't just messing with us, they were serious. There was a for sale sign staked in our front yard. I ripped it out and stormed inside. "Dad!" He was already on the phone, pacing the living room. "I don't care what she told you. The house is not for sale," he said. He paused, listening. "No, I own it." She has no right. What do you mean she already filed paperwork? I clenched my fists. Marissa was trying to sell the house out from under us before the divorce was even finalized. And just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, I was confronted by 2 police officers. "Are you Ethan?" one of them asked. Yeah." He exchanged glances with his partner. "We got a report that you were trespassing on this property." My stomach dropped. "What?" The officer shifted. "The caller said you didn't live here and that you were squatting on private property." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "This is my house." Before they could answer, my father came to the door. "Officers, there's been a mistake. This is my son. He lives here." They asked for his ID, checked some paperwork, and finally left. But the damage was done. Marissa and Lydia had tried to legally remove me from my own home. That's when I realized this wasn't just about revenge, they were going to war. After the cops left, my dad sat down at the kitchen table, gripping his whiskey glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. For years, he had let Marissa walk all over him. But this time, something was different. He wasn't just tired, he was angry. "She's not taking the house," he muttered. "She's not taking my business. She's not taking anything." It was the first time I had ever heard him talk like that about Marissa. I smirked. "So you finally grew a spine?" He looked up at me, and instead of the usual guilt or hesitation, there was something else: determination. The next morning, he called his own lawyer. By that afternoon, it had begun. Marissa's lawyer had already filed paperwork claiming she had contributed to my dad's business. Total nonsense. She had never worked a day in her life since they got married. If anything, she had drained his money, not helped him make it. But Marissa was smart. She didn't just want money, she wanted control. Her lawyer started by freezing certain assets, trying to make it harder for my dad to fight back. But for once, my dad didn't just roll over. He fought. He countersued. He had proof that Marissa had been using his business account for personal shopping sprees, luxury vacations, and even some sketchy payments to people he didn't recognize. When Marissa found out, she didn't take it well. That night, she showed up at the house. I heard the car door slam outside, followed by loud, angry footsteps. A second later, she was pounding on the front door. My dad opened it. And before he could say a word, Marissa shoved past him, her face red with rage. "You think you can do this to me?" she hissed. "After everything I've done for you?" Dad crossed his arms. "What have you done, Marissa?" "Spent my money, turned my son against me, tried to sell my house while I was still living in it," she scoffed. "This house was ours." "No," he said. "It was mine. You just lived here? And now you don't." Marissa narrowed her eyes. "You really think you're going to win this? You think you can outplay me?" Dad didn't even flinch. "I don't need to outplay you. I just need to tell the truth." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're making a mistake." "No," he said. "The mistake was ever letting you into my life." I nearly cheered. Marissa's face twisted in anger, but she must have realized she wasn't going to win this fight, because she turned on her heel and stormed out. But just as she reached the door, she looked over her shoulder at me. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" I didn't even hide my smirk. "More than you know." She glared at me, then walked out. For the first time in years, I felt something I never thought I'd feel again: relief. But I also knew this wasn't over. Marissa wasn't the type to lose quietly. And I was right, because the next thing she did, she tried to destroy everything. I thought we were finally winning. My dad had stood up to Marissa, and for the first time, she looked scared. It felt like we had the upper hand, but I underestimated her. Marissa didn't just want revenge, she wanted destruction. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. My dad was on the phone with his lawyer when his face suddenly went pale. He kept saying, "That's impossible. There has to be a mistake." When he hung up, he looked at me. "She just took half of my company." I stared at him. "How?" He ran a hand over his face. "She filed some emergency claim. saying she had managerial influence. Her lawyer convinced the judge to grant her temporary control over half of my assets until the divorce is settled. I blinked. Wait, so she's technically your business partner now? He nodded slowly, and I could tell he was barely keeping it together. That's when I got a message. It was from Lydia. Tell Daddy to check his company's website. It's got a new look. Winky face. Dread pooled in my stomach as I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the site. The entire homepage had been changed. Instead of the usual professional branding, there was a massive banner across the top, under new management, exciting changes coming soon. And right below it was a picture of Marissa and Lydia, smiling like they had just won the lottery. I turned the screen toward my dad. He stared at it, then slammed his fist on the table. She's trying to ruin me. And she wasn't stopping there. By that afternoon, she had sent emails to his biggest clients, claiming that the company was undergoing a major restructuring and that she was now the primary contact for future business deals. Some of them panicked and pulled out. Contracts were canceled, deals were put on hold. My dad was losing everything fast. And then came the final blow. That night, as we were sitting in the wreckage of our lives, the doorbell rang. My dad, tense but composed, got up to answer it. I heard him say something, then silence. When I walked over, I saw him holding a notice of eviction. "What's going on?" I asked. His hands were shaking as he read it. Marissa had found some legal loophole. Because the house was technically marital property, she had filed a claim stating that until the divorce was finalized, it had to be fairly distributed. The court hadn't ruled in her favor yet, but she had filed just enough paperwork to put a hold on everything, which meant until this was sorted out, we had to leave. Marissa had taken his money, his business, and now his house. And we had nowhere to go. For the first time in my life, I saw my dad completely defeated. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the eviction notice like it was a death sentence. Marissa had taken everything: his business, his house, his reputation. We had no home, no money, and no clear way out. But then something changed. I don't know if it was pure desperation or the realization that Marissa had never really been untouchable, but my dad did something I never expected. He fought back. The next morning, he made a call. I had no idea who it was, but an hour later, we were sitting in a small office across from a man named Raymond Holt. Raymond wasn't just any lawyer, he was a shark. The kind of guy you hired when you didn't just want to win, but you wanted to make sure the other person never got back up. Dad laid everything out: the frozen assets, the business takeover, the house situation. Raymond listened, nodding slowly, and when my dad finished, he leaned forward. "She made a mistake," he said. I frowned. "What mistake?" Raymond smirked. "She got greedy. Turns out Marissa had been too aggressive. Her legal moves were just on the edge of fraud, and Raymond knew how to push her over that edge. I have a friend at the DA's office," he said. "We're going to set a trap." The next step was simple but brilliant. My dad pretended to give up. He sent Marissa a message saying he was willing to negotiate, willing to let her keep the business, willing to sign off on spousal support. All she had to do was come to a meeting and sign some final paperwork. Marissa, being Marissa, took the bait immediately. She agreed to meet at a private office to finalize everything. She probably thought she had completely broken my dad, but what she didn't know was that the paperwork she was about to sign it was evidence. The documents were fake contracts, created by Raymond, that would legally prove she had been embezzling money from my dad's company using business funds for personal expenses, forging documents, even creating fake invoices. The moment she signed, she would be committing a crime. She showed up to the meeting dressed like she was attending an awards show, acting like she had already won. Lydia was with her, smug as ever. They sat across from my dad, and Marissa picked up the pen without even reading the papers. That's when Raymond spoke. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Marissa froze. "Excuse me?" Raymond smiled. "Because the moment you sign, I'll be handing this file over to the district attorney's office, And you, Marissa, will be facing criminal charges. For the first time in her life, Marissa looked scared. What are you talking about?" she stammered. Raymond pushed a folder toward her. "Bank statements, fraudulent transactions, business funds being redirected to your personal accounts. Shall I keep going?" Her face went pale. Lydia leaned forward. "Mom," Raymond didn't stop. "And the best part? Because you filed all these documents yourself, there's no one else to blame. It's all on you." Marissa turned to my dad, her voice shaking. You set me up." He didn't even blink. "No, Marissa, you set yourself up." She stood up so fast her chair tipped over. Lydia looked completely lost, like she had no idea what was happening. "If you try to fight this," Raymond continued, "you'll lose everything, the business, the house, your reputation. But if you sign this instead," he slid another document toward her, a divorce settlement, one that left her with nothing, no money, no business, no house, just freedom and a chance to walk away without a prison sentence. Marissa's hands were shaking. She looked at Lydia, who was staring at her like she had never seen her before. Then, with no other choice, Marissa picked up the pen and signed. It was over. A week later, my dad and I moved back into our house. It felt surreal walking through the front door, knowing Marissa was gone for good. The house felt bigger, emptier, but in a good way. My dad wasn't the same person he had been a few months ago. He was stronger, smarter, and for the first time in years, he looked happy. As for Marissa and Lydia, they disappeared. No one knew where they went, and honestly, I didn't care. That night, as my dad and I sat in the living room eating takeout and watching a movie, he turned to me. "I messed up," he admitted. I looked at him. "Yeah, you did." He nodded. "But I'll never let it happen again." And for the first time, I actually believed him.